Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Covering the Highlands and Islands, I can't but be aware of the challenges faced when providing affordable housing in rural areas. There are no economies of scale. Indeed, you wouldn't want to build on a large scale because this would have a disproportionate effect on a small community. However, it's vital that people have access to affordable housing. House prices on the open market are often well beyond the means of local people, who tend to have to work several jobs, some seasonal, and very few providing the stable income that's required to allow them to borrow privately. Set against this, the areas sought after by those wishing to buy a second home, or indeed folk moving in from other areas, these people tend to have comparatively large amounts of capital and often outbid local people. People should be able to live in the communities they were brought up in. They shouldn't be forced out. Only yesterday, the Press and Journal, there was a story about a young family from Port Mahomet whose private rent lease was coming to an end. They can't afford to buy there, but they can't be guaranteed one of the 9 new Alban houses being built in the village solely because of their local connection. They face uprooting their family, moving their children out of school and moving elsewhere. However, neither should we become so parochial that no one can move into rural areas. More affordable housing provides the answer to this problem. When speaking to housing associations in my area, the announcement made ahead of this debate on housing association grant increase by an average of 6% will be welcomed. However, this increase will not affect their ability to deliver these small developments. It's because the cost of building in these areas is higher because of lack of economies of scale, the higher cost of land, providing water, electricity and other services to the development. Housing associations will therefore continue to need to apply for additional housing association grants. This additional funding normally comes with conditions. The government impose a higher rent level on properties that get additional housing association grant. Because of the work patterns I talked about in smaller communities, these higher rents can't be passed on to tenants because they're unaffordable. Therefore, the whole funding equation falls apart. Because the assumed rent is higher than the actual rent charged, it's the actual rent that is used to borrow against. Therefore, there will always be a funding gap between housing association grant and the mortgage on the property. And for example, if you look at a house costing about $125,000 to build, your rent income in reality is $2,800 per annum, and that means a funding gap of $7,500 for that one property alone. Small rural housing associations can't afford to fund this gap, and therefore they cannot afford to build. In order to allow small rural housing associations to build, the government must stop imposing a rent level that's unaffordable in these communities. Housing associations know their tenants, they know the rent level that's affordable in the area, and they are the right people to set a fair rent, taking into account local circumstances. Many of the housing associations in my area tell me they can't build under this regime. It needs to change, and while housing association grant rises are welcome, the real problem is imposing rent levels. This doesn't take into account the effect of the credit crunch, when even the mortgage available under the previous rent assumptions may not be available, so something needs to be done. Touching just very lightly on the lead developer aspects, I can understand why people want lead developers and some of the good things they could bring, but unfortunately the model we're working with is not right. Could I ask the Minister to consider the model provided by Highland Housing Alliance that actually brings all the benefits that a lead developer would without causing competition within the housing associations? They bring together housing associations, councils and private developers in making sure that housing is unblocked and more housing is developed at efficient costing. Therefore, Deputy Presiding Officer, in conclusion, the most important issue for me in representing rural and remote communities is that the government needs to stop imposing rent assumptions where additional housing association grant is provided. To provide much needed housing in these communities, this has to be changed. There would be a small impact on the public purse, but it would have a huge impact on the number of rural affordable houses being built.